Hi, it's Dr. Bell here. It's another episode of Watch This Space. I know it's been a while and I think it's time we had a catch up because there's lots of things going on over the next few weeks. I'm going to start off with actually something that you can see at the end of May. The International Space Station has been doing lots of passes, and although we've had so much cloud, I barely had a glimpse of it, the weather is meant to be clearing over the next few days. So for example, on the 28th of May at 2 minutes past 10, if you look west, you should see the space station passing towards the southeast. As always, you can get all of the space station times on meteorwatch.org. It's a really useful source of information. As we then move into June, on June the 10th we have a new moon. Now this is where the moon is on the same side of the Earth as the sun, and so we only see the shadow of the moon and the sky is really dark. So if we get a clear night on June 10th, you should be able to see lots of stars. It should look really good. Earlier in the day on June 10th, there's going to be a partial solar eclipse, which we'll be able to see in Wellingborough. It's only 21%, so it's not like the sky's going to get really dark, and it's really important that if you're sat in your lessons while this is happening, that you're not looking out the window at the sun because it could blind you, but you might just notice that things get a little bit darker on June the 10th, between 9 minutes past 10 and quarter past 11. On the 24th of June, we have a full moon, and it's another one of those super moons that's going to look really big. So it's great if any of you want to take photos, or if you've got a telescope or binoculars, you might be able to see the craters really well. And if you're one of the planet spotters, it's not so great at the moment, but you can see Mars low in the sky if you look northwest after dusk. It doesn't last very long and it's low in the sky. And towards the end of the month, we should be able to see Jupiter and Saturn. They're going to be rising in the southeast, but it is quite late. It's after midnight, but as we move into July and August, that will get a little bit earlier. I wanted to share with you something. I'm really proud of our student Jamie in year 10. He took these photos with his telescope, and as he was taking a shot of the moon, a red kite flew across and he caught it. And this sequence of photos was entered into the BBC Sky at Night magazine, and he actually won Photo of the Month and has been published in the BBC Sky at Night magazine. It's absolutely phenomenal, so really well done to Jamie. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand over to Jamie, because Jamie has made a fantastic video about the history of spaceflight. So over to you, Jamie.
Okay, so I've been asked to do another video for the Watch This Space video series by Dr. Bell, and today I'm going to talk about the history of spaceflight. Now, obviously, humans have only been going into space for a few years, but we've had history with rockets and history with space right back since the 13th century. So today I'm going to go through a timeline of different events in the history of spaceflight which I think have made a difference in terms of where we see ourselves and also what we've managed to learn. So spaceflight actually goes right back to the 13th century in a war with the Chinese and the Mongols, where fireworks and rockets were used as projectiles to fire at the enemy. So that's the first true recording of the use of rockets, but rocketry didn't really take off, if you like, until 1926, when Robert Goddard invented the world's first liquid-fueled rocket. So it didn't go particularly high or particularly fast. It definitely didn't get into space, but it was the first use of liquid as a propellant, as opposed to the solid propellants that you find in fireworks, for example. Then in 1923, Hermann Oberth published his book on rocket travel, and so this was the first idea about how rockets would be staged and how rockets would be launched and how rockets would travel in space. And so this was really pioneering, and it helped pave the way for the future missions. But rocketry was pretty primitive at that point, and it didn't really start to become advanced until the Second World War, when Germany started to develop rockets for use as weapons against us and France and other enemies. So the first flying projectile they developed was called the V1, which was actually a pilotless aircraft. But then they developed the V2 rocket, which was, if you like, an actual rocket, and they launched it from different launch sites all throughout Germany and German occupied territory. And one example is Peenemünde. So yeah, they really developed rockets then. And as a matter of fact, the German scientists who worked on the V2 rocket actually worked on the Saturn V, which sent man to the moon. So really, rocketry has its roots in the work of the Germans during the Second World War. Then, in October 1957, the Soviet Union launched their first satellite into orbit, which is called Sputnik. So it's basically a sphere with 4 prongs poking out of it, and it was just a very primitive satellite which sent out a few beeps. But that was the first ever satellite that we managed to get into space. And then the Soviet Union followed pretty swiftly after that with the first dog in space, which is Laika. I'm sure many of you have heard of this. And Laika actually didn't make it back. She died of heat exhaustion, but she was the first living thing that, has been properly recorded as getting into space, and we could actually see her, and we could read telemetry about her, so that was quite important. And then in 1958, the US properly entered the space race with the formation of NASA. NASA was formed under Dwight D. Eisenhower, the US president, and he was really key in starting the US's commitment to space and to trying to get to the moon. But in 1961, the Soviet Union got another of the milestones where they got Yuri Gagarin into space, and he was actually the first person to orbit as well. And so yes, in 1961, he was the first human ever, and he got a hero's welcome on his return, and he went all around the world, possibly unifying countries and people. In 1968, this is well into the space race now, and the Americans are actually nearing the moon. In 1968, they got the first humans to orbit the moon. So they didn't actually land, they just sort of went round it. But this was a major milestone because it got us so much closer to the moon and showed us that the technology that we developed actually worked. And then, of course, in 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were the first humans to land on the moon on Apollo 11. And I'm sure you've heard Neil Armstrong's famous line, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." And that was said on that mission, the first lunar landing. And then there's a bit of a gap with other different missions, and then in 1971 the Soviet Union come and make the first space station to orbit the Earth. I'm sure you've all heard of the International Space Station, which I'll talk about later, but the first space station was actually called Salyut 1, and it was a combination of several spacecraft which docked together in orbit, if you like, and they sort of created this multi-vehicular space station in orbit of the Earth, and several crews actually went there and stayed there, much like they do on the International Space Station now. And then in 1972 we have the dawn of interstellar space, so travelling beyond the grip of the Sun, where Pioneer 10 exited the solar system. It was the first man-made object ever to do so, and that's paved the way for other missions such as Pioneer 11 and the Voyager spacecraft, which have shown us our solar system in greater detail than we'd ever imagined before. So then in 1976 we started to get vehicles to land on other planets. So in 1976 Viking 1 of the United States was the first spacecraft to land on Mars, and it sent back a few pictures and a few telemetry readouts, and it was rather primitive, and it didn't have a rover or anything like that, but it was a key step in getting rovers and ultimately hopefully humans to Mars. Then in 1981, the Space Shuttle, which is this on the bottom picture, that's the Space Shuttle just there. Well, that was first flown on a mission called STS-1 in 1981. The pilot was John Young, and that was basically a test flight of it, and everything worked. It was very good, and the Space Shuttle was pretty reliable. It did have a couple of accidents, which resulted in, unfortunately, some casualties, but the Space Shuttle was used to make the International Space Station, to launch hundreds of satellites into orbit, so it's very important. And in 1990, one such satellite was the Hubble Space Telescope. I'm sure many of you have heard of that. It's actually still functioning today. It celebrated its 30th year last year, and it's sent back many images that we've taken from just above the Earth's atmosphere, and the images that it sends back are brilliant. They're sort of images of galaxies very far away, and it gives us an eye in the sky that we didn't have before, which gives us these high resolution and high magnification images, which are really important in understanding deep space and what's further out there. Then in 2000, as I mentioned, the International Space Station was first occupied by human residents. It was built sort of around that time, and then it was first occupied in 2000, and that's key obviously because the International Space Station is still running now. And so yeah, it's occupied by Russian and American crews, along with Japanese and European astronauts, among other nationalities. And then in 2001, the first private tourist went into space. He had to pay a lot of money to go up, but it was a major milestone in showing that spaceflight wasn't just for governments and wasn't just for governmental organisations, it was for the corporate sector as well. So that was quite key. Then in 2004, the first corporate spaceflight is conducted by Spaceship One. So this was where this company, Spaceship One, sent their spaceship into space, and it was the first time it had been done with a privately owned vehicle as well. 2004 was the Cassini Probe, and the Cassini, along with its smaller sister probe, if you like, Huygens, orbited around Saturn, and it actually lasted until 2017 when it crashed into Saturn. But it orbited around Saturn and gave us lots and lots of data, and we learnt a lot about Saturn and its moons during the Cassini mission. Then in 2011, the Messenger probe began the first craft to orbit Mercury, and so that sent back high-resolution images of Mercury, and we were able to map its surface, so that was really key in understanding the closest planet to the Sun. Then in 2012, the International Space Station was resupplied by a corporate company for the first time. I believe it was SpaceX. They had their Dragon supply spacecraft. I believe, I may be wrong, but yeah, so that was the first time that NASA and corporate companies had worked together on the frontier of space, so that was very important. And in 2012, many of you have probably heard of this, Felix Baumgartner became the first person to break the sound barrier when he jumped out of a balloon that had risen very, very high up in the sky to the edge of space, and he jumped. He did probably the longest skydive in history, and as he went down, he broke the sound barrier. He travelled faster than sound, and there was, a sonic boom and everything, but unless he was high enough, I don't know. But and then he came down and he had his parachute, and he landed successfully, so that was quite an achievement. And then we jump to the present era, and the first corporate manned mission to the International Space Station. So previously, obviously, resupply missions had gone up, which were unmanned, but this was the first manned mission. It happened last year. I'm sure many of you probably saw it. I think it was covered in Watch This Space. Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley became the first corporate astronauts to go to the International Space Station using the SpaceX Crew Dragon capsule, and that was quite an event, and it was quite key in developing the relationship between governments and corporate providers. So that's pretty much it for what's happened in the past, but there's still lots to come in the future. So very, very recently we had the Perseverance lander, which is hoping to collect soil samples along with taking lots of high-resolution images. But in the long term, there's a plan to get humans on the moon in 2024. That's with NASA's Artemis mission using the Space Launch System. There's also plans to have a lunar gateway, which is a satellite orbiting the moon, which we'll be able to use for deep space missions. And then ultimately in 2035 is currently the deadline. NASA hopes to land the first humans on Mars. Now, humans obviously haven't got there. We have got rovers there, but we've never got any humans there, so it'd be really important to get rovers there, to get humans there. So thank you very much, and I'll hand back to Dr. Bell.
Oh, thank you for that, Jamie. That was absolutely fantastic. I'm sure we all learned a lot about spaceflight from that video. If anybody else would like to contribute to Watch This Space, please get in touch. You can send me an email through your school email, or you can find me around school. I'd love to get contributions from other students. But thank you very much, Jamie, and I hope some of you go outside and have a look up over the next month. Bye.